Without me, she'd be homeless. My father's voice echoed through the courtroom so loudly that even the court reporter stopped typing for half a second. A few people chuckled. I didn't look up. I just kept my hands folded in my lap and stared at the worn wooden railing in front of me, while the old ceiling fan turned lazily overhead. Savannah Summers had a way of making every room feel sticky, even a county courthouse. Then Judge Whitmore looked directly at me, not at my lawyer, not at my father, at me. And in a voice so calm it almost frightened me, he asked, "So, they really don't know?" The room went still. My father's attorney blinked hard. "Your Honor, know what?" Judge Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair. "Actually, she is." He stopped himself. And that was the exact moment my father's face lost all its color. But none of that happened first. No, the truth is my life had already fallen apart long before that courtroom. And the saddest part, my own family never noticed. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 61 years old, divorced, retired, and until recently the entire town of Savannah believed I was a washed-up old woman living off her father's generosity. Truthfully, I let them believe it. By the time the lawsuit started, I'd been living quietly at the Hayes estate for almost 7 years. The house sat just outside Savannah near Isle of Hope, tucked behind giant oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was old Southern money kind of property. Wide porches, tall windows, cracked brick paths. The sort of place people admired while driving past slowly. My father loved telling people it had been in the family for generations. That wasn't exactly true. But again, I let people believe what they wanted. Most mornings, I woke before sunrise, made black coffee, and sat on the back porch listening to cicadas while the river breeze drifted through the trees. I liked the quiet. After the kind of life I'd lived, quiet became precious. 3 days a week, I volunteered at the VA clinic downtown. Most people there knew me simply as Maggie. That was enough. I helped older veterans fill out paperwork, drove a few of them to appointments, and sometimes just sat beside lonely men who needed someone willing to listen to stories nobody else had patience for anymore. Old soldiers recognize certain things in each other. Discipline. Silence. The habit of sitting where you can see every exit. I noticed them noticing me. But nobody asked questions. That generation understood boundaries. My father, Walter Hayes, understood none. At 82, he still carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. He'd once run a successful construction company back in the 70s and 80s when Savannah was growing fast. Back then, people respected him. Or maybe feared him. Sometimes those two things look similar when you're young. My mother passed away 12 years ago, and after that, whatever softness existed in my father disappeared with her. He became harder, sharper, meaner in quiet little ways. Especially toward me. My younger brother Daniel could do no wrong. Didn't matter that he was 58 years old and buried in debt from failed real estate deals. My father still introduced him proudly at church breakfasts like he was some rising young businessman. Me, I was Margaret, said with disappointment attached to every syllable. She never recovered after the divorce, he'd whisper to neighbors. Or she lives here because family takes care of family. The truth sat right in front of him every day, and he never saw it. The Sunday dinner that started, everything happened in late August. Savannah heat wrapped around the house like wet wool that evening. Daniel arrived wearing loafers without socks and talking loudly into his phone about some condo development that probably didn't exist. His wife Crystal carried a store-bought peach pie and acted exhausted before she even sat down. I made pot roast. Nobody thanked me. That wasn't unusual. Halfway through dinner, my father dabbed his mouth with a napkin and casually announced, "I've decided to sell the property." I looked up slowly. Daniel froze mid-bite. "The taxes are getting ridiculous," my father continued. "And frankly, this place is too much house now." He glanced directly at me. "So you'll need to make arrangements, Margaret." Crystal avoided eye contact. Daniel suddenly became fascinated with his iced tea. I set my fork down carefully. "You can't sell it." The room went silent. My father laughed once. "Excuse me. You can't sell the estate." His eyes narrowed immediately. I'd seen that look my entire life. It always appeared right before he decided someone needed humiliating. "I think I know what I own." I held his stare calmly. "No, you don't." Daniel finally jumped in nervously. "Come on, Maggie, don't start this tonight." But my father was already angry now. "You've lived under my roof for 7 years, he snapped. "Without me, you'd be living in some government apartment." I almost smiled at that. Government apartment. If only he knew. Instead, I stood quietly and gathered plates from the table. "You should talk to a lawyer before trying to sell it," I said softly. That only made him angrier. The next week he did exactly that. Within 10 days I was officially served with eviction papers. Daniel called afterward, pretending to sound sympathetic. "You know how Dad gets," he sighed over the phone. "Just apologize and this all goes away." "For what?" A long silence. "Then you always have to make things difficult." I nearly laughed. At my age, you start recognizing patterns clearly. Families create roles for each person, and once they do, they cling to those roles even when reality changes. Daniel was the golden son. I was the disappointment. Nothing, not success, sacrifice, or truth, was allowed to interrupt that story. The lawsuit spread through Savannah faster than summer thunderstorms. At the diner near Waters Avenue, people whispered when I walked in. Poor Margaret. Living off her father. Probably mentally unstable after the divorce. I heard it all, and I let them talk. Because after 30 years in military intelligence, I'd learned something important. People reveal themselves fully when they think you're powerless. 2 weeks before the first hearing, I stopped by the courthouse to file paperwork with my attorney, Patricia Hale. Patricia was 73 years old, sharp as broken glass, and one of the few people in Georgia who knew the full truth about me. As we entered the courthouse lobby, an elderly bailiff looked up from his desk. The second he saw me, his posture changed instantly. Straight spine, squared shoulders. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said quietly. "Not Miss Hayes. Not Margaret." "Ma'am?" Patricia noticed my father standing across the lobby with Daniel. They noticed it too. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face, only for a second. Then his pride swallowed it whole. The first court hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in September, right after a week of heavy rain. Savannah smelled like wet pavement and magnolia trees that morning. The courthouse steps were slick, and reporters from the local paper had already gathered outside by 8 o'clock. Small-town people love embarrassment almost as much as they love church, especially when the embarrassment belongs to someone else. I arrived alone in my old blue pickup truck wearing a plain gray suit I'd owned for years. No jewelry except my wedding ring, which I still wore even after Harold passed. Some habits stay with you longer than grief. Across the street, I noticed my father immediately. Walter Hayes stood near the courthouse entrance, shaking hands like he was campaigning for mayor. Daniel hovered beside him, carrying folders and coffee cups, trying too hard to look important. My father spotted me and smirked. That same expression he'd worn my entire childhood whenever he believed he was winning. "Morning, Margaret," he called loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear. "Hope you brought a place to stay after this." A few people laughed nervously. I kept walking. One thing military service teaches you is how to survive humiliation without reacting emotionally. If you respond to every insult, eventually your enemies control your heartbeat. Patricia Hale met me inside near the security checkpoint. She carried one leather briefcase and looked completely unimpressed by the crowd gathering around the case. "You sleep at all?" she asked quietly. "Enough." She studied me for a moment. "You still have time to end this peacefully." I almost smiled. I tried peace for 40 years. That shut the conversation down. Courtroom 3 sat on the second floor overlooking Reynolds Square. Old wood benches, faded carpet, air conditioning that barely worked. The room smelled like dust, coffee, and old paper. The kind of room where lives quietly come apart every day. As people filled the gallery seats, I noticed several older veterans scattered throughout the room. Mr. Delaney from the VA clinic, Frank Morrison, retired Marine Corps, even Earl Benson, who usually couldn't leave his house because of breathing problems. None of them looked directly at me, but they came. That mattered. My father's attorney was a man named Richard Coleman, mid-60s, expensive haircut, gold cufflinks, the sort of lawyer who smiled too often because he enjoyed humiliating people professionally. He approached our table before proceedings began. "Mrs. Hayes," he said pleasantly, "my client is still willing to avoid further embarrassment if you vacate voluntarily." Patricia answered before I could. "My client isn't interested." Coleman sighed dramatically. "That's unfortunate." No. What was unfortunate was that men like him spent entire careers mistaking kindness for weakness. Judge Whitmore entered exactly at 9 sharp. Everyone rose. The moment he saw my nameplate at the defense table, something changed in his expression almost too quickly to notice. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. Then it vanished. The hearing began routinely enough. Property records, residency timelines, financial statements. Coleman performed for the room constantly. My client generously allowed his emotionally struggling daughter to remain in the residence following her divorce. Emotionally struggling. Interesting phrase. Despite her inability to financially support herself independently, I stared straight ahead. Years ago, during intelligence briefings overseas, I'd sat across from men who threatened lives casually while drinking coffee. Compared to that, Richard Coleman was just noise wearing a necktie. Still, I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There's something uniquely painful about sitting silently while strangers discuss your worth like a broken appliance, especially when your own father nods along. At one point, Coleman held up photographs of the estate. "This property has belonged to the Hayes family for decades," he announced confidently. Mr. Hayes paid taxes, maintenance costs, and utilities, while his daughter contributed essentially nothing. The judge glanced briefly toward Patricia. She didn't move, didn't object, didn't even blink. That unsettled him more than an argument would have. During recess, I stepped into the hallway near a window overlooking the square. Rain clouds hung low over Savannah, dark and heavy. A younger deputy approached quietly. "Excuse me, ma'am." I turned. He looked nervous. "Judge Whitmore asked me to make sure you're comfortable if you need anything." I studied him carefully. Young, maybe 35. Former military too, judging by posture alone. "I'm fine," I said. He hesitated before nodding respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." Across the hallway, Daniel watched the exchange with confusion written all over his face. Good. For the first time, tiny cracks were appearing in the story they'd built about me. At lunch, Patricia and I walked to a small diner 2 blocks from the courthouse. No reporters followed us. They preferred louder people. Patricia ordered tomato soup. I drank coffee. Finally, she asked, "You nervous?" "About the case number. About what happens after." That question sat heavier, because she understood something important. The courtroom wasn't the painful part. Truth was, I looked out the window at passing traffic. My father built his entire identity around being the strong one. And men like him don't survive humiliation well. Patricia stirred her soup slowly. He made his choices. Maybe. But when you spend your whole life protecting people, even the ones who hurt you, it becomes difficult to stop. That afternoon, court resumed with testimony from Daniel. Watching my younger brother lie under oath felt strangely exhausting. "She's always depended on Dad," he claimed carefully, emotionally and financially. I almost interrupted then. Almost. Because 20 years earlier, Daniel had called me crying from a casino parking lot in Biloxi after losing nearly everything gambling, and I'd wired him $40,000 before sunrise. No lectures, no humiliation, no conditions. Family protects family. At least that's what I believed back then. When Daniel finished testifying, he avoided looking at me completely. Cowardice often looks like confidence until pressure arrives. Near the end of the hearing, Judge Whitmore reviewed preliminary documents quietly from the bench. Then suddenly he paused. A long silence filled the courtroom. He adjusted his glasses slowly while reading one particular page. Then he looked directly at me. Not hostile, not curious, respectful. My father noticed it immediately. "Your Honor," Coleman prompted nervously. Whitmore closed the file. "There appear to be additional ownership records requiring verification." Coleman frowned. "We already submitted complete documentation." "Apparently not." The room shifted uneasily. My father leaned toward his lawyer, whispering angrily. Judge Whitmore continued calmly, "I'm scheduling another hearing in 2 weeks." Coleman stood quickly. "With respect, Your Honor, this is a straightforward eviction matter." The judge's expression hardened instantly. "No," he said quietly. Then he glanced toward me again. "It may not be." That sentence followed us all the way out of the courthouse. Outside, reporters crowded around my father asking questions. He smiled confidently for cameras, pretending nothing had changed. But I noticed something others didn't. For the first time since filing the lawsuit, Walter Hayes looked uncertain. Just uncertain enough to be afraid. The second hearing drew twice as many people. By then, Savannah had turned the whole thing into entertainment. At the grocery store, strangers stopped talking when I passed. At the diner near River Street, people whispered behind coffee cups. Even at church, I caught older women glancing at me with pity that felt heavier than judgment. Poor Margaret, losing her home, suing her own father. Nobody knew the truth. And after a while, I started wondering if maybe I preferred it that way. The morning of the hearing, rain hammered the roof of the estate before sunrise. I stood on the back porch with a cup of black coffee, watching water collect along the brick paths. The oak trees swayed slowly in the wind. That house had survived hurricanes, floods, and 3 generations of bitterness. Funny thing was, the house itself had never really belonged to the Hayes family at all. At 8:30, Patricia arrived to pick me up. "You ready?" she asked gently. "No," I admitted. She nodded once. "Good. Means you're still human." The courthouse looked different that morning. Crowded. Tense. 2 local news vans sat outside near the entrance, and reporters clustered beneath umbrellas waiting for my father to arrive. Walter loved attention. Even now, at 82 years old, he still straightened his shoulders whenever cameras appeared. Daniel stepped out behind him wearing an expensive suit he probably couldn't afford. My father spotted me across the street and smiled coldly. That smile disappeared exactly 43 minutes later. Courtroom 3 filled early. Retired neighbors, curious strangers, veterans from the VA clinic. Even a few local attorneys came just to watch. Patricia organized paperwork calmly beside me. "You don't have to say more than necessary," she reminded me. "I know. Once this starts, there's no putting it back." That part sat heavily in my chest. Because despite everything my father had done, some part of me still wanted to protect him from humiliation, which says more about me than him. Judge Whitmore entered right at 9. The room rose. He looked unusually serious that morning. Richard Coleman began aggressively trying to regain control before Patricia could speak. "Your Honor, this case has already wasted enough taxpayer time," he announced loudly. "The facts remain simple. Mr. Walter Hayes owns the property. His daughter resides there without legal standing." The judge said nothing. Coleman continued confidently. "We've provided tax records, maintenance receipts, utility bills." "Submitted by whom?" Patricia interrupted calmly. Coleman frowned. "By the property owner." Patricia slid a folder across the table. "That assumption appears to be incorrect." The courtroom shifted quietly. My father crossed his arms immediately. "What nonsense is this?" Patricia stood. I'd known her almost 15 years, and I'd never seen her nervous once. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "the estate known as Hayes Manor was purchased in 1998 under a private defense trust registered in Virginia." Coleman laughed outright. "That's impossible." Patricia ignored him completely. "The trust's sole financial contributor and controlling beneficiary is Margaret Hayes." Silence. Not normal silence. The kind that physically changes a room. My father blinked hard. "What?" Daniel stared at me like he'd never seen me before. Coleman recovered first. "This is some kind of clerical error." "It is not," Patricia replied. She handed additional documents to the bailiff. Judge Whitmore reviewed them carefully. And then something happened I will never forget. The old bailiff standing beside the bench glanced down at my name on the paperwork and subtly straightened his posture. Military. Instantly recognizable. Across the gallery, I noticed Frank Morrison from the VA lower his eyes quietly. A few veterans already understood exactly where this was heading. Coleman kept talking rapidly now. "Even if some trust exists, that doesn't explain." Judge Whitmore interrupted softly. "It explains quite a lot." My father leaned forward angrily. "Margaret doesn't have that kind of money." Nobody answered him immediately. "Because the truth sounded absurd if you'd spent your whole life underestimating someone." Patricia opened another folder. "For 31 years, she said calmly, my client served in United States Naval Intelligence." The room froze. Daniel whispered, "What?" My father actually laughed once. A nervous, broken sound. "That's ridiculous." Patricia continued anyway. "Margaret Hayes retired with the rank of Rear Admiral." The silence afterward felt enormous. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. I kept my eyes on the table because suddenly everyone in the courtroom was staring at me. Not with pity anymore, with shock. Judge Whitmore looked directly toward the gallery. As some of these records remain partially classified, he said carefully, "This court will not discuss operational details." Operational details. That phrase landed differently. You could feel it. My father's face had gone completely pale now. Daniel looked physically sick. Coleman tried speaking again but stumbled over his own words. "Your Honor, surely military service has nothing to do with property ownership." "No," Whitmore replied quietly. "But integrity does." The courtroom stayed perfectly still. And for the first time in my life I saw my father afraid of me. Not because I'd threatened him, not because I'd yelled, but because the story he built about me was collapsing in public. Piece by piece. Patricia continued presenting financial records. Trust statements, purchase agreements, wire transfers. Every document led back to me. The estate had never belonged to Walter Hayes. Not legally. Not financially. Not once. 26 years earlier, after my second overseas deployment, I purchased the property through a protected trust because my father's construction company was collapsing under debt. He never knew. I made sure of that. At the time, preserving his pride seemed kinder than exposing his failure. So I let him pretend. For decades, my father shook his head slowly. No, this can't be right. I finally spoke. Quietly. It's right. The sound of my own voice startled him more than the documents did. Walter stared at me with genuine confusion now. You bought this house? Yes. Why would you do that? That question nearly broke my heart, because he truly didn't understand. I looked at the old man sitting across the courtroom from me and remembered every Christmas my mother tried keeping peace between us. Every phone call I answered in the middle of the night. Every debt quietly erased, every humiliation swallowed. Because you were my father, I said softly. His eyes filled instantly. But the hearing wasn't finished. Patricia calmly revealed more. The medical bills after my mother's cancer treatments. Mine. Daniel's business bailout 15 years earlier. Mine. The back taxes that saved the estate from seizure during the recession. Mine. Every time disaster struck, the Hayes family invisible hands had protected them. My hands. And still somehow I became the disappointment. The room no longer looked at my father with admiration, only discomfort. Maybe shame. Judge Whitmore finally removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes tiredly. Then he looked directly at Walter. Mr. Hayes, he said quietly, I would strongly advise against continuing this action. But my father barely heard him. He just kept staring at me, like a man realizing too late that he never actually knew his own daughter. Nobody spoke to my father after the hearing ended. That was the first thing I noticed. Usually, Walter Hayes walked through Savannah like a man campaigning for office. People greeted him loudly. Men shook his hand. Women smiled politely. He fed off attention the way some people feed off whiskey. But after the courtroom revelation, the hallway outside courtroom 3 felt different. Quiet. People stepped aside as he passed. Not out of respect, out of discomfort. Daniel kept trying to speak to him while reporters crowded near the courthouse doors. Dad, let's just go, he whispered urgently. But Walter stood frozen near the hallway window staring at me while I gathered paperwork beside Patricia. I could practically hear his entire understanding of his life collapsing. Finally, he walked toward me slowly. For a second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he asked how long. I looked up. How long what? How long were you planning to humiliate me? The question hit harder than I expected. Even now, after everything, he still believed he was the victim. I wasn't, I said quietly. He laughed bitterly. You let me stand in there looking like a fool. Patricia stepped between us immediately. You filed the lawsuit, Walter. But he barely heard her. His eyes stayed locked on me. All these years, he muttered. You just sat there letting people think I took care of you. Yes. Why? I opened my mouth once, closed it again. Because the truthful answer sounded pathetic. Because I loved you. Instead, I said it seemed easier. His expression twisted into something between anger and shame. Then reporters rushed toward us. Admiral Hayes, Admiral Hayes. I flinched slightly at the title. I hadn't heard it spoken publicly in years. Camera flashes lit the hallway. Is it true you led naval intelligence operations in the Gulf? Did you receive the Distinguished Service Medal? Why did you hide your military career? Walter stared at the reporters in total disbelief. You could see the exact moment he realized the humiliation wasn't temporary. The whole town was going to know. By evening, Savannah already did. I stopped for groceries on the drive home, and the cashier nearly dropped a carton of eggs when she recognized me. Oh, my lord, she whispered, you're that woman from court. That woman. Not poor Margaret anymore. An older man near the register slowly removed his veteran cap when he saw me. Vietnam Navy. Ma'am, he said softly. I nodded politely. At ease, sailor. He laughed so hard he nearly cried. But not everyone reacted kindly. Daniel arrived at the estate around 7 that evening, already furious. I heard his Mercedes tearing up the gravel driveway before he even knocked. You embarrassed Dad in front of the entire city. I stayed seated on the porch swing. He embarrassed himself. That's not fair and you know it. I looked at my younger brother carefully. For the first time in decades, he seemed genuinely frightened. Not of me. Of losing the life he depended on. You lied to us for years, he snapped. No, I answered calmly. I stayed quiet. There's a difference. Daniel paced across the porch angrily. You made Dad look weak. That sentence explained everything. Not cruel, not unfair. Weak. Because in my family, weakness was the unforgivable sin. I took a slow breath. Did you ever once ask where your business bailout came from? His face changed instantly. There it was. The memory. 15 years earlier, Biloxi, 3 a.m. You said it was an anonymous investor, he whispered. It was? Oh my God. You were about to lose everything. He sat down heavily in the porch chair. For several minutes, neither of us spoke while cicadas buzzed loudly in the humid dark. Finally, Daniel asked the question I'd secretly waited years to hear. Why didn't you tell us? I looked out toward the oak trees. Because once people know what you are, I said softly, they stop seeing who you are. That wasn't entirely true. The deeper truth was uglier. I was tired. After decades in military intelligence, after burying friends, after failed marriages and classified funerals, and years spent carrying responsibilities nobody could discuss openly, I didn't want to be Rear Admiral Margaret Hayes anymore. I just wanted to be someone's daughter. Unfortunately, my family only respected power they could see publicly. The next morning, reporters camped outside the estate gates. By afternoon, old photographs surfaced online. Me in uniform beside Navy officials. Me standing near aircraft carriers. Me receiving medals at ceremonies I barely remembered. The town lost its mind. At the VA clinic, veterans who'd barely spoken to me before now stood awkwardly whenever I entered the room. I hated that. Respect based on rank always felt emptier than respect earned quietly. That afternoon, Patricia called. You need to see this. She emailed me financial documents from Daniel's real estate company. I stared at the numbers silently. Massive debt. Hidden loans. Second mortgages. He was drowning. Again. A few hours later, Walter appeared at the estate unexpectedly. Alone. No reporters. No anger. Just exhaustion. I found him sitting in the backyard near the garden my mother planted 30 years ago. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, was any of it real? I frowned slightly. What? You needing us. The sadness in his voice caught me off guard, because suddenly he didn't sound like the powerful father from the courtroom anymore. Just an old man terrified his life had been built on illusion. I did need you, I answered honestly. When? All the time. That seemed to hurt him more than anything else. Walter rubbed his hands together slowly. I thought, after your divorce? After you came back home? I came back because I was tired, I interrupted gently, not broken. He stared down at the garden. I don't understand why you'd protect us after everything. I almost told him the truth then. That soldiers get trained to protect people even when those people don't deserve it. But instead I said Mom would have wanted me to. His eyes filled immediately. For the first time in my life, my father looked old. Not commanding, not intimidating. Just old. And deeply ashamed. But pride doesn't die quickly in men like Walter Hayes. Before leaving, he paused near the porch. You could have ruined me years ago. I know. Why didn't you? Because revenge sounds satisfying when you're hurt. Until you finally get the chance. Then all you see standing in front of you is family. I never wanted revenge, I said quietly. That courtroom wasn't revenge. What was it? I looked him directly in the eye. The truth. The strangest thing about winning is how quiet it feels afterward. Television dramas make revenge look satisfying. Somebody gets exposed, the bad people suffer, and the hero walks away feeling powerful. Real life doesn't work that way. 3 weeks after the courtroom hearing, the town of Savannah still talked about little else. Everywhere I went, people stared. At the pharmacy, at church, at the marina downtown. Some smiled respectfully now. Others looked embarrassed like they personally owed me an apology for believing the worst about me all those years. But none of it brought peace. If anything, the silence inside the estate felt heavier than before. One evening, I sat alone on the back porch, listening to rain tap softly against the roof, while an old Navy coffee mug warmed my hands. The oak trees swayed slowly in the dark, and for the first time in years, I seriously considered leaving Savannah for good. Not because of the lawsuit. Because I no longer recognized my own life. By then, newspapers had published nearly everything they legally could about my military career. Local woman revealed as retired Rear Admiral. Secret naval career stuns Savannah courtroom. I hated every headline. People suddenly treated me differently. Strangers thanked me for my service in grocery aisles. Men who once ignored me at community meetings now shook my hand too firmly. Respect based on revelation always feels strange when you spent decades invisible. At the VA clinic, things changed most of all. The older veterans looked at me differently now. Not with fear, with understanding. One Thursday afternoon, Frank Morrison cornered me near the coffee machine. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the Marines and spent most days complaining about government paperwork. "You know," he muttered, "you should have told people." I smiled faintly. "And listened to everyone salute me for 20 years. Better than letting your old man treat you like dirt." That landed harder than he realized. Frank leaned against the counter carefully. "Men like your father," he said quietly. "They don't know what to do with daughters who become stronger than them." I looked away, because deep down I knew he was right. My father still hadn't fully recovered from the public humiliation. Walter stopped attending church breakfasts, stopped golfing, stopped meeting friends downtown for coffee. Savannah is a small enough city that shame travels faster than forgiveness. People talked, especially older men. Some secretly admired him for standing up to his daughter. Others thought he was a fool for humiliating a decorated officer publicly. But regardless of opinion, Walter Hayes became a story people whispered about. And proud men rarely survive whispers well. Daniel's situation unraveled even faster. Without realizing it, he'd spent years building his life around invisible financial safety nets I quietly provided. Once I stopped covering emergencies, overdue loans began surfacing everywhere. One Friday evening, he arrived at the estate looking exhausted. Not angry this time, broken. His expensive Mercedes was gone. Instead, he drove an old rental car with a cracked windshield. I found him standing awkwardly near the porch steps. "You busy?" he asked quietly. "Never too busy for family." The words almost made him cry. We sat outside while the evening sun disappeared behind the trees. Finally, he admitted everything. The gambling, the loans, the fake business deals, the second mortgage on his house. Listening to him felt like listening to a much younger version of my father. Pride, fear, performance. Men exhausting themselves, pretending they're stronger than they are. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed, Daniel whispered. "That usually makes it worse." He nodded slowly. Then came the question I knew was waiting. "Did you really pay off my casino debts?" "Yes." "Why?" I stared out across the dark lawn. "Because Mom called me crying." Daniel covered his face with both hands. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never expected to hear from my younger brother. "I think Dad hated you because you never needed his approval." I let that sit quietly between us. Because the truth was more complicated. I had needed his approval once. Desperately. Back when I was 23 and leaving for my first naval assignment overseas, I waited all night hoping my father would tell me he was proud of me. He never did. After a while, disappointment becomes familiar enough that you stop fighting it. 2 days later, everything changed again. Around midnight, Patricia called my cell phone. "Margaret," she said immediately, "your father's in Memorial Hospital." I stood up so quickly my coffee spilled across the kitchen counter. "What happened?" "Minor stroke. Daniel found him collapsed in a motel room." Motel room. That word hit me hard. After the lawsuit embarrassment, Walter quietly moved out of the estate rather than face me every day. Pride again. He rented a small room near Highway 80 instead. At 82 years old. Alone. I drove to the hospital through pouring rain. Daniel sat outside the emergency wing looking completely shattered. "He kept saying he didn't want charity," he whispered when he saw me. My chest tightened painfully. Because even now, after everything my father still believed, accepting love made him weak. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and stale air conditioning. Walter looked smaller somehow lying in that bed. Older. Fragile. For a moment I didn't see the angry man from the courtroom. I saw my father teaching me how to ride a bicycle when I was 6. Time is cruel that way. Walter opened his eyes slowly when I entered. And to my surprise, tears formed immediately. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Just that. No excuses, no speeches, no pride. I sat beside the bed quietly. "You don't have to talk right now." "Yes, I do." His voice cracked badly. "All those years," he whispered, "you were protecting us." I looked down at my hands. "You were my family." Walter began crying openly then. The kind of crying older men usually spend entire lives trying to avoid. "I punished you for becoming everything I never was," he admitted weakly. That sentence broke something inside me. Not because it shocked me. Because it confirmed what I'd always secretly known. He reached for my hand carefully. "I was proud of you," he whispered. "I just didn't know how to say it." At 61 years old, hearing those words still hurt like a child hearing them too late. But sometimes too late is still enough to matter. Winter arrived slowly in Savannah that year. The oak trees around the estate stood bare and quiet, their branches stretching over the property like old hands reaching toward memory. For the first time in decades, the house no longer felt heavy with tension. It felt peaceful. Not perfect, but peaceful. My father came home from the hospital 3 weeks before Christmas. Not to reclaim the estate. Not to argue. Just to recover. I converted the downstairs study into a bedroom for him because climbing stairs had become difficult after the stroke. At first, he resisted every small kindness. Proud men often do. I can manage myself, he muttered the first morning I brought him coffee. I know, I answered calmly, but you don't have to anymore. That usually silenced him. Recovery changed Walter more than age ever had. Before the stroke, he moved through life like a man constantly defending territory nobody was trying to steal. Afterward, something inside him softened. Maybe fear finally reached the part pride had protected for too long. Or maybe loneliness did. Some mornings I found him sitting quietly on the back porch, watching sunlight move through the trees. Just sitting, thinking. One cold January afternoon, he surprised me by asking to visit the VA clinic. You sure I asked carefully? He nodded. I owe some people an apology. I didn't ask which people. At the clinic, several older veterans recognized him immediately from the newspaper stories. The room turned awkwardly quiet for a moment. Then Frank Morrison rolled forward in his wheelchair and broke the tension himself. Well, Frank grunted loudly, look who finally decided to join civilized society. To my surprise, Walter laughed. A real laugh. Not sarcastic, not bitter. Just human. That day mattered more than I expected. Because instead of defending himself, my father listened. He listened while old veterans described losing marriages after deployments. He listened while widows explained loneliness after retirement. He listened while men his age admitted how difficult it was to apologize after spending entire lifetimes pretending strength meant silence. For once in his life, Walter Hayes stopped talking long enough to learn something. Meanwhile, Daniel slowly rebuilt his own life from the ground up. He sold the oversized house, took a regular office job, started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week. The first few months humbled him badly. One evening, he helped me repair broken fencing near the back pasture while the sun set over the marshlands. I used to think success meant people envying you, he admitted quietly. And now, he hammered another nail into the fence post before answering. Now I think peace is probably worth more. That sounded like growth. Real growth usually arrives painfully. By spring, the estate itself had begun changing too. For years, the property existed mainly as a symbol wealth family pride status. I didn't want that anymore. So with Patricia's help, I established the Hayes Veterans Retreat, a nonprofit program offering temporary housing and support for older veterans, widows, and seniors facing financial hardship. Not luxury, just dignity. Simple rooms, warm meals, quiet safety. The first residents arrived in March. An Army widow from Macon whose son lost her retirement savings. A retired mechanic living in his truck after medical bills destroyed him financially. An elderly Navy nurse with early Parkinson's and nowhere else to go. Watching them settle into the estate changed the atmosphere completely. For the first time, the house finally became useful instead of impressive. My father helped more than anyone expected. At first, he repaired furniture simply to stay busy. Then he started organizing donations, fixing porch railings, and teaching younger volunteers carpentry skills. One afternoon, I caught him showing an old Marine how to plant tomatoes in my mother's garden. Both men argued the entire time. It was the happiest I'd seen him in years. The official opening ceremony happened on Veterans Day. Nothing fancy. A few folding chairs under the oak trees, coffee, homemade pies, neighbors, veterans, families. Judge Whitmore attended quietly without any public attention. Patricia came too, wearing her usual expression of permanent irritation. Even several reporters showed up. But this time nobody came looking for scandal. Only stories. Toward the end of the gathering, Daniel tapped his glass gently for attention. I think Dad wants to say something. Walter immediately looked irritated. I told you not to do that. A few people laughed softly. But then my father stood slowly from his chair, leaning slightly on a cane now. The crowd grew quiet. Walter looked at me for a long moment before speaking. My daughter spent most of her life protecting people, he said carefully, including people who didn't deserve it. I felt my chest tighten immediately. He cleared his throat. For years I introduced Margaret as someone who needed help. He paused. The truth is, she's the strongest person I've ever known. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter somehow. Walter looked embarrassed by his own honesty, which made it even more meaningful. Then he added softly, and I wasted too many years being too proud to admit it. I walked over and hugged him before he could say anything else. He held on tightly. Old men who spent entire lives avoiding emotion sometimes hold hugs differently once they finally surrender to them. Later that evening, after everyone left, I sat alone on the back porch watching sunset fade through the Spanish moss. The estate glowed softly behind me, full of voices, laughter, and life again. For the first time in many years, the house no longer carried secrets. Just people healing. I thought about revenge then. About how badly I once wanted my father to finally understand what he'd done to me. And strangely enough, when that moment finally came, it didn't feel like victory. Not really. Victory would have been having a father who loved openly from the beginning. But life rarely gives us perfect endings. Sometimes it only gives us honest ones. If there's anything this story taught me, it's that the quiet people in life are often carrying the heaviest burdens. The ones overlooked at family dinners, underestimated in courtrooms, or dismissed because they don't brag about themselves. Those are often the people holding entire families together silently. So if someone in your life loves quietly, notice them. And if pride has kept you from saying the words someone deserves to hear, don't wait as long as we did. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still needs reconciliation while there's time. And if you believe dignity, forgiveness, and quiet strength still matter in this world, I hope you'll stay for the next story. The first thing Derek said when he opened the door was, "Get back inside before the neighbors see you." He thought I was my sister. He thought the frightened woman standing on his porch was the same woman he'd thrown out into a storm with 2 newborn babies. He thought he still had all the power. What he didn't know was that I'd spent 20 years in the Navy SEAL teams, and what happened over the next few weeks would change all of our lives forever. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at the time of this story, I was a Navy SEAL chief stationed near Norfolk, Virginia. I'd spent most of my adult life solving problems in places most Americans only saw on the evening news. Desert heat, mountain snow, long deployments far from home. I thought I'd seen the worst people could do to each other. I was wrong. The night everything started, I was driving home from Norfolk during one of those cold Virginia storms that seemed determined to wash the entire state into the Atlantic Ocean. Rain hammered against my windshield. The wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. I was exhausted. I'd just finished a difficult stretch of work, and all I wanted was a hot shower, a warm meal, and a full night's sleep. Instead, I stopped for gas. The station sat along a lonely stretch of highway about 40 minutes outside Norfolk. Most people were hurrying inside to escape the rain. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought I was looking into a mirror. My twin sister Emily sat on a metal bench beneath the station's overhang. She was soaked. One of the babies was wrapped inside her coat. The other rested against her shoulder beneath a damp blanket. Both infants couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Emily's hands were trembling. For a moment, I simply stood there. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I hurried toward her. "Emily." She looked up. The second she recognized me, tears filled her eyes. "Oh, Sarah." The way she said my name made my stomach tighten. I knelt beside her. "What happened?" She tried to answer. Instead, she started crying. Not loud crying, not dramatic crying, the quiet kind. The kind that comes after someone has already exhausted themselves from hurting. I carefully took one of the babies into my arms. The little girl felt freezing cold. My military training disappeared. In that moment, I wasn't a SEAL. I wasn't a chief. I was simply an older sister. "Emily," I said softly, "talk to me." She swallowed. "Derek threw us out." I stared at her. "What?" He said he was done pretending. My jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" Emily looked down. "I found messages. I already knew where this was going." "He was having an affair," she nodded. "For months." The rain continued pounding the roof overhead. I listened as she told me everything. The lies, the secret credit cards, the late nights, the excuses. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He laughed. Actually laughed. Then he told her she should be grateful he stayed as long as he did. 3 days later, he changed the account passwords. 2 days after that, he transferred money. And that afternoon, he threw her and the babies out. Just like that. No warning. No concern. No plan. A mother recovering from childbirth and 2 newborn infants standing in the rain. I looked down at my niece. The tiny girl yawned and squeezed my finger. Something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something steadier. The same feeling I'd learned to trust during difficult missions. The feeling that appears when a situation becomes unacceptable. "Where are you staying tonight?" I asked. Emily laughed bitterly. I don't know. That answer broke my heart. Nobody should ever have to say those words, especially not while holding newborn babies. I took a deep breath. You're not staying here. I don't want to be a burden. I almost smiled. Emily had always worried about everyone except herself. You're my sister. I know. No, I said. You don't. Because if our positions were reversed, you'd already be dragging me into your car. For the first time all evening, she smiled. A small smile. But it was there. I helped her into my truck. The baby settled into the back seat. We drove through the storm. As she talked, I learned more. Derek had become increasingly controlling over the last 2 years. He monitored spending, questioned every purchase, criticized everything. The affair wasn't the beginning. It was simply the final chapter. About an hour later, I pulled into the driveway of an old friend from the military. Tom and his wife Linda had fostered children for years. Good people. Reliable people. The kind of Americans who quietly make their communities stronger. Without hesitation, they welcomed Emily and the babies inside. Linda immediately began preparing a guest room. Tom carried supplies upstairs. Within minutes, Emily was surrounded by warmth and kindness. I watched relief wash across her face. Then an idea appeared. At first, it sounded ridiculous. Then it sounded possible. Finally, it sounded necessary. Emily and I had always looked nearly identical. Even as adults, strangers confused us. Derek had never met me. Not once. He knew about me. He'd seen photographs. But we'd never been in the same room. I slowly turned toward my sister. She stared back. The same realization had reached her. No, she whispered. Maybe. Sarah. What if he thinks you're coming back? Emily's eyes widened. The room grew quiet. Tom looked between us. Linda stopped folding blankets. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Emily shook her head. It's dangerous. Maybe it was. But another thought had already formed. For years, Derek had controlled the situation. For years, Emily had reacted. For once, I wanted him reacting. I wanted him believing everything was still under his control. While we learned the truth. While we gathered facts. While my sister finally had room to breathe. I stood and grabbed Emily's coat. Sarah. I looked at her. For the first time that night, I saw something besides fear in her eyes. Hope. Just a little. But enough. Outside, the storm continued raging across Virginia. I slipped into her coat, picked up her phone, and headed for the door. For 20 years, I'd faced dangerous men in difficult places. Tonight, I was driving toward something different. A man who believed kindness was weakness. A man who believed fear was power. A man who thought nobody would ever challenge him. He was about to make a very expensive mistake. I expected Derek to be angry when I returned to the house. What I didn't expect was how comfortable he seemed. Comfortable with cruelty. Comfortable with control. Comfortable with believing the woman standing in front of him had nowhere else to go. The moment he opened the door, his expression wasn't worried. It was irritated, like I'd interrupted his evening. Get inside, he snapped. Rain blew across the porch behind me. I lowered my head slightly, copying Emily's posture. The twins and Emily were safe. That thought gave me confidence. I stepped into the house. Derek locked the door behind me. Then he walked past without even looking back. No apology. No concern. No questions. Just confidence. The house itself was exactly what you'd expect from a middle-class Virginia suburb. 2-story colonial. Attached garage. Family photos on the walls. Children's toys stacked in corners. The appearance of a normal American family. But after 20 years of military service, I'd learned something important. A clean house doesn't mean a healthy home. Sometimes the most dangerous situations are hidden behind ordinary front doors. Derek dropped onto the couch. The television blared. A football game. He pointed toward the kitchen. There's leftover casserole. I stared. That's all you have to say. His eyes narrowed. For a moment I worried I'd pushed too far. Then he laughed. You're not seriously expecting me to apologize. I lowered my gaze again. No. Good. He returned his attention to the television. The conversation was over. At least for him. I quietly moved through the house. Every room told a story. Emily's story. The nursery had been arranged with care. Framed baby photos. Handmade blankets. A rocking chair. Yet something felt off. There were almost no pictures of Emily. Plenty of Derek. Plenty of Derek's parents. Plenty of vacations. But very few of the women who actually lived there. At first glance it seemed insignificant. But it wasn't. Abusive people often rewrite reality. They slowly erase the importance of everyone else. I saw evidence of that everywhere. The next morning Derek revealed even more. I made coffee. He walked into the kitchen. Did you call your mother? No. Good. I looked up. Why? Because she'll just start taking your side. I nearly laughed. My side. Emily had been thrown into a storm with newborn babies. Yet somehow Derek saw himself as the victim. He sat down, opened his laptop, and started complaining. For nearly 20 minutes. About Emily. About money. About responsibilities. About how difficult his life had become. The entire time he never once mentioned the twins. Not once. As though his own children barely existed. I listened quietly. The less I spoke, the more he talked. That had always been true of arrogant people. Silence makes them reveal themselves. By afternoon, I had learned something else. Derek loved hearing himself talk, especially when he believed he was winning. Over the next several days, I settled into a routine. I acted nervous, quiet, submissive, everything he expected Emily to be. Meanwhile, I watched, listened, recorded. Every conversation went into a secure app on my phone. Nothing illegal. Virginia law allowed one-party consent recordings. Years in the military had taught me the value of documentation. Facts matter. Evidence matters. Memories can be challenged. Recordings cannot. The more Derek relaxed, the more reckless he became. One evening he sat at the dining room table drinking beer. You know why this happened? I looked down. No, because you stopped appreciating me. I almost rolled my eyes. Instead, I remained silent. He continued. I work hard. Another sip. I deserve happiness. Another sip. Besides, Melissa actually respects me. Melissa, the affair partner. Interesting. Derek had never used her name before. Now he couldn't stop talking about her. For nearly 30 minutes he praised another woman while believing he was speaking to his wife. The level of selfishness was astonishing, but useful. Very useful. 3 days later, I got my first real break. Derek left for work and forgot his home office door was unlocked. Inside, I found stacks of financial paperwork. Nothing dramatic at first. Mortgage statements, tax returns, utility bills. Then I noticed something strange. Several bank statements were missing. Only certain months remained. I took photographs. Then more photographs. Then more. Military training again. Observe everything. Assume nothing. By lunchtime, I'd copied dozens of documents. That evening, I sent them securely to a retired military attorney I'd known for years. His reply arrived shortly after midnight. Call me tomorrow. We may have a problem. The next morning, another surprise arrived. Derek's mother, Helen. She appeared at the front door carrying a casserole dish. The moment she saw me, she frowned. Not because she suspected I wasn't Emily, because she knew something was wrong. Might I come in? Of course. We sat at the kitchen table. Helen was 72, sharp-eyed, kind-faced. The sort of woman who remembered birthdays and mailed handwritten cards. After several minutes, she quietly reached across the table. Sweetheart. I looked up. Yes. How bad is it? The question stunned me. She already knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. What do you mean? Helen sighed. Derek wasn't raised this way. The sadness in her voice felt genuine. I don't know where I failed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me again. If he hurt you, you don't have to protect him. My heart softened. Many parents defend their children no matter what. Helen wasn't doing that. She looked heartbroken, not blind. That conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Carefully, I listened. She revealed years of troubling behavior. Small lies, manipulation, entitlement. Nothing criminal. But together they painted a clear picture. Derek's behavior hadn't appeared overnight. It had grown slowly over time, like rust, quietly spreading until serious damage became impossible to ignore. After Helen left, I sat alone in the kitchen. The pieces were beginning to fit together. This wasn't simply a cheating husband. This wasn't merely a failed marriage. This was a man who had spent years convincing a good woman she had no value. A man who believed fear was a useful tool. A man who counted on silence. That evening, another piece fell into place. A neighbor named Frank stopped by. Retired electrician. Vietnam veteran. Good man. While Derek was inside taking a call, Frank quietly spoke to me. You all right? I nodded. He didn't believe me. His eyes lingered. Then he said something important. If you ever need a witness, I've seen more than people realize. My pulse quickened. A witness. Interesting. Very interesting. After he left, I wrote everything down. Every detail. Every observation. Every name. The circle was growing. Allies. Witnesses. Documents. Evidence. And Derek still believed he was in complete control. Late that night, he sat across from me in the living room. His feet rested on the coffee table. The television glowed softly. Without warning, he smirked. "You know what's funny?" I looked up. "What?" He laughed. A cold laugh. The kind that made my skin crawl. "Nobody would believe you anyway." Then he returned his attention to the television, as if he'd said nothing important, as if he'd merely commented on the weather. I stared at him, and in that moment something became crystal clear. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about accountability. For years he'd relied on fear. For years he'd counted on nobody paying attention. That was over. Because for the first time in his life, someone was... The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Old habits. 20 years in the Navy had trained my body to rise early whether I wanted to or not. The house was quiet. For a few moments I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and reviewed everything I'd gathered so far. The recordings. The photographs. The financial documents. Helen's observations. Frank's offer to serve as a witness. Individually, none of it would bring Derek down. Together it painted a picture. And the picture wasn't pretty. At 7:30 my phone vibrated. A text message from Emily. The twins slept 4 hours straight. First time since they were born. "Thank you." I smiled. Then another message arrived. "Linda made pancakes. I think we're okay." That one hit me harder. We're okay. Such simple words. Yet they reminded me why I was doing this. Not for revenge. Not for satisfaction. For safety. For dignity. For a woman who had spent years forgetting she deserved both. A few minutes later, I stepped outside and called the retired military attorney who had reviewed the financial documents. His name was Robert Gaines, former Navy JAG. Smart. Patient. The kind of lawyer who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He answered on the second ring. "Morning, Chief." "Morning. You were right to call." My stomach tightened. "What did you find?" A brief pause. Enough to concern me. I listened carefully. Several account transfers appeared unusual. Large sums had been moved between accounts shortly before Emily was thrown out. Nothing automatically illegal, but definitely suspicious. Then came something more troubling. "It looks like some signatures may not match." I sat straighter. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if additional documents exist." My military instincts immediately activated. Missing information. Hidden assets. Unanswered questions. All signs pointed toward a larger problem. Robert continued. "If this goes where I think it's going, you'll need documentation. Every piece you can find." "Already working on it." "I figured you would." After the call ended, I began planning. The difference between chaos and success often comes down to preparation. That lesson had kept people alive during deployments. It worked just as well in civilian life. Over the next week, I became a student of Derek's routines. What time he left. What time he returned. Where he kept paperwork. Which passwords he reused. How often he checked mail. Every detail mattered. Meanwhile, Derek became increasingly comfortable. One evening he came home carrying expensive takeout. Steak. Seafood. A bottle of wine. He dropped the bags onto the counter. "Melissa recommended this place." There was that name again. Melissa. The woman helping destroy his marriage. I kept my expression neutral. "You seem serious about her." He laughed. "Of course I am." Then he said something astonishing. I should have left years ago. I almost forgot to remain in character. Years ago. Emily had supported him through layoffs, medical issues, financial struggles. Years ago, she'd worked 2 jobs while he finished a certification program. Yet somehow he had rewritten history. People like Derek often do. They create stories where they're always the hero. Everyone else becomes disposable. The following Friday, another opportunity arrived. Derek left town overnight for what he claimed was a business conference. The moment his car disappeared, I went to work. His home office yielded more records. Tax files, insurance papers, loan applications. Then I found a locked drawer. Not unusual, but interesting. Inside the desk, taped beneath a shelf, sat a spare key. Predictable. Very predictable. I unlocked the drawer. My pulse quickened. There they were. Additional bank statements, investment records, property documents, and something else. A folder labeled family. I opened it. Immediately I saw Emily's name. Several pages later, my heart sank. Loan applications, credit accounts, documents carrying signatures that looked similar to Emily's, but not identical. I photographed every page, every signature, every account number. By the time I finished, I had hundreds of images. That evening, I forwarded everything securely to Robert. His response arrived less than an hour later. "Call me now." That wasn't encouraging. When I reached him, he got straight to the point. "If these signatures are forged, Derek has serious problems." "How serious?" "Potentially life-changing." I leaned back in my chair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert asked a question. "How much does your sister know?" "Almost nothing." "Then prepare her carefully." I knew exactly what he meant. Victims often discover abuse in layers. The full truth can be overwhelming. After ending the call, I drove to visit Emily. The twins were sleeping when I arrived. Tom and Linda welcomed me inside. The atmosphere felt completely different from Derek's house. Warm, peaceful, safe. Emily looked better. Still exhausted. Still healing. But stronger. We sat together on the back porch while the babies napped inside. For a while, we simply watched the evening sky. Then she spoke. "I forgot what quiet feels like." That sentence broke my heart. Nobody should forget something so basic. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You deserve this." She shook her head. "No." "Yes." Tears filled her eyes. "Derek always said I was lucky he stayed." I felt anger rise inside me. Not explosive anger. The controlled kind. The kind that waits. "Emily." She looked at me. "Do you believe that—" A long silence followed. Finally, she whispered, "No." It was the first time she'd said it aloud. The first crack in the wall he'd built around her confidence. And once cracks appear, walls eventually fall. When I returned to Derek's house that night, another surprise awaited me. A detective from Norfolk whom I trusted had reviewed some public records I'd asked him to examine. Nothing official. Nothing improper. Just publicly available information. The results were eye-opening. Derek's financial situation wasn't nearly as strong as he'd claimed. In fact, several debts appeared hidden. Substantial debts. Suddenly, his behavior made even more sense. The affair. The money transfers. The secret accounts. The panic. He wasn't just selfish. He was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Over the next few days, those mistakes multiplied. Derek began signing paperwork without reading carefully. He moved money. Made phone calls. Sent emails. Each action created a trail that investigators, attorneys, and eventually a judge could follow. By the end of the week, the picture was becoming clear. For years, Derek had operated under one assumption. Nobody was paying attention. Nobody was checking. Nobody was keeping score. He was wrong. And he still had no idea how wrong. The collapse started on a Tuesday morning. Not with handcuffs. Not with sirens. Not with some dramatic scene from a television crime show. It started with a letter. One simple letter sitting on the kitchen counter. I was pouring coffee when Derek walked into the room. He looked tired. For the first time since I'd met him, he actually looked worried. His eyes landed on the envelope. He frowned. "What's this?" I shrugged. "It came yesterday." He grabbed it. The moment he saw the return address, the color drained from his face. Interesting. Very interesting. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he opened it. I watched carefully. Years of military service had taught me how to read people. Tiny movements, facial tension, changes in breathing. Derek's reaction told me everything. Whatever was in that letter scared him. He quickly folded the paper and shoved it into his pocket. "What is it?" I asked quietly. "Nothing." "A lie." "An obvious one." He grabbed his keys. "I'm going to the office." Then he left without touching his coffee. The front door slammed behind him. I waited 30 seconds. Then I smiled. The pressure had begun. Over the next several days, more letters arrived. Questions from financial institutions. Requests for clarification. Formal notices. Nothing catastrophic by itself, but together they created a problem. Because every lie requires maintenance. And Derek had been lying for years. The larger the lie, the harder it becomes to protect. By Friday evening, his confidence had noticeably changed. The arrogant man who once lounged comfortably on the couch now paced through the house, checking emails, making calls, drinking more than usual. One night I overheard him arguing with Melissa. The conversation happened in the backyard. He thought nobody could hear. Unfortunately for him, military training had given me excellent hearing. "I told you I'd handle it." A pause. Then louder. "No, that's not what's happening." Another pause. His voice grew sharper. "Because people are asking questions." Silence followed. Then came the sentence that told me everything. "If you leave now after everything I've done for you." The call ended shortly afterward. Derek walked back inside looking furious. Melissa was pulling away. When trouble arrived, loyalty suddenly became less attractive. I wasn't surprised. Affairs often survive on fantasy. Reality tends to ruin them. The following Monday brought another development. Robert called. Good news. I sat straighter. Let's hear it. The financial investigator finished his review. That got my attention. And several transactions appear intentionally concealed. I leaned back. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Months earlier, I might have celebrated. Instead, I felt something different. Sadness. Because every discovery revealed another choice Derek had made. Another opportunity he had to do the right thing. Another moment he had chosen himself. How strong is the case? I asked. Robert answered carefully. Strong enough that I'd hate to be sitting in Derek's chair. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I looked out the kitchen window. The spring weather was finally arriving in Virginia. The storm that had started this story felt far away. Yet the damage it revealed was still unfolding. That afternoon I visited Emily. The twins were awake, healthy, alert, beautiful. One baby gripped my finger. The other stared at me with serious blue eyes. Emily laughed softly. She always looks like she's judging people. Smart kid. For the first time in weeks, we shared a genuine laugh. Then Emily grew quiet. Do you think he'll ever understand what he did? I considered the question carefully. Older people understand something younger people often miss. Consequences don't automatically create wisdom. Sometimes people learn. Sometimes they don't. I don't know, I admitted. But he's running out of excuses. Emily nodded. That seemed enough. As I prepared to leave, she stopped me. Sarah. I turned. Yeah. Her eyes filled with emotion. You gave me time to breathe. The words stayed with me all day. Not revenge. Not victory. Time to breathe. Sometimes that's what people need most. A chance to remember who they are. When I returned to Derek's house that evening, I found him sitting alone in darkness. No television. No music. No phone. Just silence. The sight surprised me. For the first time, he looked small. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man beginning to understand the walls were closing in. He looked up. Do you think I'm a bad person? The question caught me off guard. I studied him. Part of me wanted to answer honestly. Another part remembered the role I was playing. I don't know. He laughed bitterly. Neither do I. For a moment, I glimpsed something human beneath the arrogance. Regret, perhaps? Or fear? Maybe both. Then the moment passed. The next day, everything accelerated. A formal legal filing arrived. Additional financial reviews followed. Questions multiplied. Deadlines appeared. Suddenly, Derek spent his evenings buried in paperwork. The confident smile vanished. So did the constant criticism. Fear had replaced it. One afternoon, Helen stopped by again. She sat quietly at the kitchen table. After a long silence, she spoke. I know something is happening. I nodded. I figured. She folded her hands. When this is over, please remember he's still my son. The request struck me deeply. Because she wasn't asking me to excuse him. She wasn't denying reality. She simply loved her child. Even when he disappointed her. Especially when he disappointed her. That kind of love is difficult. Many older Americans understand that. Family isn't always easy. Sometimes family breaks your heart. I reached across the table. I understand. Tears filled her eyes. Thank you. The following week delivered the final blow. Emily arrived. Not alone. With Robert. With documentation. With evidence. With confidence. Derek was standing in the living room when she walked through the front door. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he looked at me. Then back at Emily. Then back at me again. Confusion spread across his face. His breathing changed. The realization hit him all at once. 2 women. Identical faces. Standing side by side. His mouth opened. No words came out. Emily stood taller than I'd seen her stand in years. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't afraid. Hello, Derek. The room became completely silent. His eyes moved toward me. What is this? I calmly stepped forward. My name is Sarah. The color disappeared from his face. For the first time since I'd met him, Derek looked genuinely terrified. And deep down I knew something important. The man who had spent years controlling everyone around him had finally lost control of the story. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence in that living room felt heavier than any argument. Derek stood frozen between Emily and me, trying to process what he was seeing. 2 identical women. One he had spent years controlling. The other had spent 20 years hunting down problems and refusing to back away from difficult situations. His eyes shifted from Emily to me again. Then he pointed. You, his voice cracked. You've been here this whole time. I nodded. Yes, the room fell silent again. I expected anger. I expected shouting. Instead, I saw fear. Real fear. Not the kind Derek had spent years creating in others. The kind that comes when someone realizes their choices have finally caught up with them. Robert calmly placed a folder on the coffee table. Mr. Harper, I suggest you review these documents. Derek didn't move. What documents? Evidence. The word landed like a hammer. Emily stood beside me, strong, steady, nothing like the frightened woman I'd found at the gas station. Derek looked at her, then down at the folder, then back at her. For the first time, he seemed to understand something. Emily wasn't alone anymore. She never should have been. But she wasn't now. Slowly, he opened the folder. The color drained from his face page by page. Financial records, account transfers, property documents, credit applications, copies of signatures, witness statements. The recordings didn't even need to be mentioned yet. The paperwork alone was devastating. Derek, Robert said calmly, this situation can still be handled professionally if you cooperate. Derek slammed the folder shut. This is ridiculous. A familiar response, denial. People often cling to it when reality becomes uncomfortable. Emily spoke softly. Is it? Derek looked at her. His expression hardened. For a brief moment I saw the old version of him. The controlling version. The one who used intimidation as a tool. Then he noticed Robert. Then me. Then the folder. The confidence vanished. Because intimidation only works when people are afraid. And nobody in that room was afraid anymore. Over the next several weeks, the legal process moved forward. There were meetings, financial reviews, mediation sessions, lawyers, paperwork, long conversations. The dramatic revenge people imagine rarely happens in real life. Real accountability arrives slowly. One document at a time, one decision at a time, one consequence at a time. And sometimes that hurts more. Melissa disappeared almost immediately. Apparently, her interest in Derek had been closely connected to the version of himself he'd presented. Successful, stable, confident. Once that image cracked, she vanished. I wasn't surprised. Neither was Emily. One evening she called me. The twins were asleep. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. But I also heard something else. Peace. Melissa left him. I nodded. I heard. A long pause followed. Then Emily surprised me. I don't even feel happy about it. I understood exactly what she meant. At a certain point, revenge stops feeling satisfying. Mostly because healthy people eventually stop wanting revenge. They want healing. How are the babies? I asked. The smile returned to her voice. Growing too fast? That answer made me laugh. Every parent says that. Every grandparent says it too. The weeks continued passing. Emily secured a small rental home near Tom and Linda. Nothing fancy. Just a comfortable place where she could start over. I helped move furniture. Frank helped install shelves. Church friends delivered meals. Neighbors donated baby clothes. Watching people come together reminded me of something I'd always loved about America. Most communities still contain good people. You don't always notice them until life becomes difficult. Then suddenly they're everywhere. Helping. Carrying boxes. Dropping off casseroles. Checking in. Showing up. Meanwhile, Derek's world kept shrinking. His debts became impossible to hide. His financial problems surfaced. His professional reputation suffered. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that destroyed his life. But enough to force him to confront reality. One afternoon I encountered Helen outside the courthouse. She looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone carrying a weight she couldn't put down. We sat together on a bench. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally she sighed. I keep wondering where I went wrong. I looked at her. You didn't create every choice he made. Tears appeared in her eyes. He's still my little boy. There it was. The truth every parent understands. Children grow older, but they never stop being your children. Even when they disappoint you. Even when they break your heart. I gently squeezed her hand. That doesn't mean you approve of what he did. She nodded. Slowly. Painfully. But she nodded. The mediation sessions eventually reached their conclusion. Emily received financial protections. Custody arrangements were established. The twins' future became secure. Most importantly, Emily regained control of her own life. Then something unexpected happened. During the final meeting, Derek broke, not emotionally at first, physically. His shoulders sagged. His voice softened. His confidence disappeared. For months he had fought every accusation, every document, every consequence. Now he simply looked tired. Very tired. Finally, he turned toward Emily. The room became silent. Even the attorneys stopped talking. Derek swallowed hard. Then he spoke. "I'm sorry." Nobody responded. Not immediately. Because real apologies aren't measured by words. They're measured by truth. Several seconds passed. Then he continued. "I blamed everyone except myself." His voice shook. "I blamed you." Another pause. "I blamed work." Another pause. "I blamed stress." He looked down. "But it was me." The room remained silent. No dramatic music. No sudden forgiveness. Just honesty. Perhaps for the first time in years, Emily listened carefully. Then she surprised everyone, including me. "I'm not ready to forgive you." Derek nodded. Slowly. "I understand. But I'm also tired of carrying anger." That sentence changed everything. Because forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Emily wasn't excusing his behavior. She wasn't pretending it never happened. She was simply refusing to let bitterness control the rest of her life. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As we walked toward the parking lot, she slipped her arm through mine. The afternoon sun warmed the pavement. For the first time since the storm, I felt something loosen inside me. The fight was ending. The healing could finally begin. 6 months later, I found myself sitting in a folding chair beneath a shade tree holding one of my nieces, while the other slept peacefully in a stroller nearby. The storm was gone. Not just the weather. The entire season of chaos. The fear. The uncertainty. The endless phone calls. The legal meetings. The sleepless nights. All of it felt distant now. Not forgotten. But finally behind us. A gentle spring breeze moved across the backyard. Children laughed somewhere down the street. A lawnmower hummed in the distance. The smell of barbecue drifted through the neighborhood. It was one of those ordinary American afternoons that people rarely appreciate until life reminds them how precious ordinary can be. I looked around the yard. Friends filled folding chairs. Neighbors chatted near the grill. Tom stood proudly flipping burgers. Linda was carrying lemonade to a table covered with desserts. Frank was telling one of his Vietnam stories to anyone willing to listen. Nobody seemed to mind hearing it for the 10th time. In fact, several people were laughing. It felt like family. The kind family isn't always born into. The kind that's built. Emily stepped onto the back porch carrying a bowl of potato salad. She looked completely different from the woman I'd found at the gas station. Not physically, emotionally. Her shoulders were straighter. Her smile came easier. The constant tension had disappeared from her face. Healing hadn't happened overnight. There had been difficult days. Lonely days. Days when the twins cried nonstop. Days when bills arrived. Days when memories hurt. But she'd kept moving forward. One step at a time. And eventually those steps added up. Just like they always do. She caught me watching her and smiled. "What?" I laughed. "Nothing. You're doing it again." Doing what? Looking at me like you're evaluating a mission. That made me laugh harder. Maybe she was right. 20 years in the Navy had given me certain habits. Emily sat beside me. For a few moments we watched the twins. Then she quietly said something that surprised me. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly." I shook my head. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." Her voice became serious. "When you found me that night, I was broken." I immediately started to disagree. She stopped me. "No." Her eyes met mine. "Let me finish." So I did. She looked across the yard. I truly believed everything he said about me. That admission hurt to hear. But it was important. Because emotional abuse rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with doubt. Then insecurity. Then isolation. Until eventually the victim starts repeating the lies themselves. Emily continued. "I thought I was weak. You weren't." "I know that now." She smiled softly. "But I didn't then." A long silence followed. The kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with conversation. Finally, she looked at me. "You didn't save me because you're a Navy SEAL." I felt my throat tighten. "You saved me because you're my sister." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder, just like she used to when we were kids. And suddenly I wasn't a retired warrior. I wasn't a chief. I wasn't the woman who had spent 2 decades serving her country. I was simply a sister. And honestly, that felt more important. As the afternoon continued, another guest arrived. The conversations gradually quieted. Not completely. Just enough for people to notice. Derek had entered the yard. He looked different too. Older somehow. Humbler. Life has a way of doing that. Particularly when someone spends months confronting consequences they never expected. Nobody rushed to greet him. Nobody applauded. Nobody treated him like a hero. But nobody chased him away either. He quietly walked toward the picnic tables, then stopped, unsure, almost uncomfortable. Emily saw him. Their eyes met. For a moment I wondered what would happen. Then Emily did something remarkable. She walked over and spoke to him. Not warmly, not coldly, simply respectfully. Two adults, two parents, trying to build something healthier than what existed before. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. When it ended, Derek stepped back. He nodded, then moved toward a different group of guests. Nothing dramatic, no movie ending, no magical reconciliation. Just progress. Small progress. And sometimes that's enough. Later that evening, as the sun began setting, I sat alone near the fence line. The twins were asleep. The party was winding down. The backyard glowed with golden light. I found myself thinking about that stormy night again. The gas station, the cold rain, Emily's frightened face, the babies wrapped in blankets. At the time, everything felt hopeless, like the future had been stolen. But life is strange. Sometimes the worst night of your life becomes the beginning of something better. Not because suffering is good. It isn't. But because difficult moments reveal things. Strength, character, loyalty, love. The people who truly show up when it matters. I learned that lesson many times in the military, and I saw it again here at home. The storm had revealed who Derek was, but it had also revealed who everyone else was. Tom, Linda, Frank, Helen, the church community, the neighbors, Emily herself. People willing to help. People willing to stand beside someone who felt alone. People willing to remind another human being that they mattered. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, I looked toward the house one last time. Emily stood on the porch holding one of the twins. She was laughing. Really laughing. The kind of laugh that comes from peace. And in that moment I realized something. That night we switched places. But what truly changed wasn't who Derek saw. It was who my sister finally saw when she looked in the mirror. A woman worth loving. A woman worth protecting. A woman who never needed anyone's permission to believe in herself. And maybe that's the lesson I hope people carry away from this story. No matter your age, no matter your mistakes, no matter how long someone has tried to convince you otherwise, your value does not belong to another person. It belongs to you. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about someone who may need encouragement today. Share this story with a friend or family member who believes they're facing their struggles alone. And if you'd like to hear more stories about courage, family resilience, and second chances, I'd be honored if you joined us again. Thank you for spending this time with me. Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing. My father said it loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smiled. One man near the back actually chuckled. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Heavy, ugly, impossible to ignore. I stared at my father across the courtroom. William Morgan, 68 years old, owner of a successful construction company in Columbus, Ohio, a respected businessman, a church donor, a man people described as honorable, a man who had spent most of my life treating me like I was a mistake. And at that moment he looked proud, not angry, not emotional, proud, as though humiliating his own daughter in public was some kind of achievement. Then I laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a bitter laugh, a genuine laugh. The kind that escaped before I could stop it. My father's smile vanished. "What's so funny?" he snapped. Before I could answer, the judge looked up from the documents in front of him. His eyes settled on me. For a moment he looked confused, then curious, then strangely familiar. "Wait," he said. The entire courtroom became silent. He leaned forward. "You're the girl who..." And suddenly every person in that room was staring at me. But to explain what happened next, I need to tell you how I got there. Because that courtroom battle didn't begin that morning. It started more than 20 years earlier, back when I was a little girl trying desperately to earn my father's love. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life, I believed there was something wrong with me. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Columbus. My father built houses. My mother stayed home. My older brother, Michael, was 6 years ahead of me. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. Inside the house, things felt different. Michael was my father's pride. I was simply there. I noticed it before I was 10 years old. If Michael got a B on a test, Dad celebrated. If I got straight A's, Dad nodded and changed the subject. If Michael scored a touchdown, Dad invited the whole family out for dinner. If I won an academic award, he usually forgot to attend the ceremony. At first I thought I just needed to try harder. Children always assume they can earn love. So I tried. God knows I tried. I worked harder in school, helped around the house, avoided trouble, made honor roll every year. Nothing changed. One evening when I was about 13, I finally asked my mother, "Dad doesn't like me much, does he?" She looked heartbroken. For a second I thought she might tell me the truth. Instead, she smiled weakly. "Of course he loves you." I remember staring at my plate. "That's not what I asked." She never answered. That silence followed me for years. Michael didn't help. As we got older, he became increasingly like our father. Confident, entitled, certain the world revolved around him. Dad gave him opportunities I never received. A summer job at the company, a company truck, business mentoring, networking introductions. When Michael graduated college, Dad handed him a management position. No interview, no competition. Just handed it over. I worked my way through nursing school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Dad barely noticed. Then September 11th happened. Like millions of Americans, I watched the towers fall. Something changed inside me. I wanted my life to matter. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. A year later, I joined the Army. The conversation with my father remains one of the clearest memories of my life. We sat at the kitchen table. I was 20 years old, nervous but excited. "Dad, I enlisted." He stared at me. "What?" "The Army." For several seconds he said nothing. Then he laughed. Not because he thought I was joking, because he thought I was stupid. "The Army." I nodded. "I want to serve." His face hardened. "You want to throw your life away." "I don't see it that way." "Of course you don't." That was the beginning of our longest argument. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I had made my decision. He accused me of abandoning the family. I reminded him Michael already had the company. Eventually he stood up. "You'll regret this." I never forgot those words. Because I never did regret it. Not once. Military life wasn't easy. There were deployments, long nights, dangerous situations, friends who didn't come home. But for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Nobody cared whose daughter I was. Nobody cared who my father favored. The Army measured performance, character, discipline, trust, things I could actually control. Over time, I became a combat medic, then an officer. I built a career, built friendships, built a purpose. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father grew colder. Phone calls became rare. Visits became shorter. Every holiday felt like walking into a room where I wasn't wanted. Still, I kept trying. Because no matter how old we get, part of us remains that child waiting for a parent to finally say, "I'm proud of you." The words never came. Years passed. Then my grandfather died. Grandpa Henry was different from my father. Kind, patient, fair. He treated Michael and me equally. When I visited, he asked about my deployments, my patience, my life. He listened, actually listened. After he passed away, I was devastated. The funeral was difficult. But what happened afterward proved even worse. A few months later, my father informed me there would be an estate hearing. Nothing unusual. Families handle inheritances every day. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I didn't care much about the money. I attended out of respect for my grandfather. Then I arrived at the courthouse. The atmosphere felt strange immediately. Michael looked smug. My father looked confident. My mother looked nervous. The attorneys exchanged paperwork. The hearing began. One document after another was reviewed. Then came the announcement. Michael would receive nearly everything. The company shares, the investment accounts, the properties, the savings, everything. I received nothing. Not a dollar, not a keepsake, not even my grandfather's old watch. Nothing. For a moment I simply sat there, trying to process what I'd heard. Then my father leaned toward me. A smile spread across his face. The smile of a man finally delivering a punishment he'd waited years to give. And that's when he said it. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing." The room became silent. I looked at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because suddenly something felt very wrong indeed. And judging by the expression forming on the judge's face, I wasn't the only one who sensed it. The courtroom remained quiet after my father's remark. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between us. Some people looked embarrassed for me. Others looked curious. Most seemed to assume they were witnessing a simple inheritance dispute. A bitter daughter. A disappointed father. Nothing unusual. The judge, however, wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking directly at me. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with recognition. The kind of expression someone gets when they're trying to remember where they've seen a face before. He glanced down at the paperwork, then back at me, then down again. The room felt strangely still. Even my father seemed unsettled. "Your Honor," his attorney finally asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said slowly. "Have we met before?" I blinked. "No, sir." His forehead wrinkled. "That's odd." He studied me another moment. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to the documents. The hearing resumed. But something had changed. I could feel it. The judge wasn't paying attention the same way he had before. Every few minutes he'd glance toward me again, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Meanwhile, my father sat confidently beside Michael. Neither of them noticed. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. They believed they had already won. And maybe they would have, if life hadn't taken a very unexpected turn several years earlier. A turn my family knew almost nothing about, because they never asked. Most of my military career was invisible to them. They knew I served. They knew I deployed. That was about it. Whenever I visited home, conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Dad would ask when I planned to leave the Army. Michael would talk about the company. Mom would try to keep everyone polite. Then we'd all go home. No one ever asked what I had experienced overseas. No one ever asked what I had seen, or who I had become. Perhaps that's why they never learned about Afghanistan. 5 years earlier, I was serving as a combat medic attached to an Army unit operating near Kandahar. It wasn't my first deployment, but it was the hardest. The region was dangerous. Roadside bombs, rocket attacks, constant uncertainty. Every day required focus. The smallest mistake could get someone killed. By then I was a captain, experienced enough to stay calm under pressure, at least most of the time. The incident that changed everything happened on an unusually hot afternoon in July. I remember the heat more than anything. The air felt thick. The dust seemed to cover everything. We had just returned from a patrol when alarms sounded across the compound. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Then the explosion hit. The blast shook the ground beneath us. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the air. People started yelling. Training took over. Everyone moved automatically. Soldiers rushed toward defensive positions. Medics rushed toward the wounded. I ran toward the explosion. Not because I was brave, because that's what medics do. When everyone else runs away from danger, we run toward it. The damaged structure was partially collapsed. Fire spread rapidly through one section. Several soldiers had been trapped inside. The situation was chaotic. People shouted conflicting information. Nobody knew exactly how many were missing. I remember reaching the building entrance. A sergeant grabbed my arm. "Captain, it's too dangerous." I pulled free. "There are still people inside." Then I went in. The smoke was overwhelming. Visibility was terrible. The heat felt like opening an oven door directly into my face. Inside, everything was confusion. Broken concrete, twisted metal, falling debris. I located the first injured soldier near a collapsed wall. He was conscious but unable to walk. I dragged him outside, then went back in, again and again. Each trip became more dangerous. The fire continued spreading. Parts of the structure were becoming unstable. Someone outside shouted that the roof might collapse. They were probably right. But there were still voices inside. I could hear them. One belonged to a young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, pinned beneath debris, terrified. I managed to reach him during my 4th entry. The situation was bad. His leg was trapped. Smoke was thickening. The ceiling groaned above us. For a moment, I honestly thought we might both die there. But somehow we got him free. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments. The weight. The heat. The exhaustion. The sound of people yelling outside when we emerged. Then darkness. I woke up 2 days later. Concussion. Smoke inhalation. Minor injuries. Nothing life-threatening. The lieutenant survived. So did several others. In total, 6 soldiers were pulled from that building. The Army conducted an investigation. Statements were collected. Reports were written. Then life moved forward. At least for me. The military later awarded me a medal for the rescue. There was a ceremony, a few photographs, some media coverage. The usual things. I never thought much about it afterward. Most veterans don't. You do your job. You move on. Besides, countless service members had done far more heroic things than I ever would. What mattered to me was simple. People came home alive. That was enough. The strange part came months later. A letter arrived. Handwritten. Unexpected. Inside was a message from the father of the young lieutenant I had helped rescue. He thanked me for saving his son, said there were no words large enough to express his gratitude. The letter was deeply personal, heartfelt. I kept it in a drawer. Nothing more. Life continued. Another deployment. Another assignment. Another year. Eventually I forgot about the letter altogether. And apparently my family never knew it existed. Not that they would have cared. Back in the courtroom, the hearing entered its second hour. The attorneys continued discussing assets, property valuations, account transfers, legal language that bored everyone except the lawyers. I noticed the judge becoming increasingly distracted. At one point, he removed his glasses entirely. He stared at me, not casually, intently. Then he opened a folder, flipped through several pages, stopped. His eyes widened. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. The judge suddenly looked as though he had found something important. Very important. Slowly he raised his head. The courtroom fell silent again. My father shifted in his chair. "What is it?" Michael whispered. Nobody answered. The judge continued staring at me. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then his expression changed completely. Recognition. Absolute recognition. As if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. He leaned forward. "Miss Morgan?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice sounded almost disbelieving. "Your full name is Rachel Ann Morgan." "Yes, sir." He sat back slowly. A look of astonishment crossed his face. Then he whispered words that made my heart skip. Words I never expected to hear in that courtroom. Dear God. The judge stared at me, and suddenly I realized he remembered exactly who I was. Dear God. The judge's voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet somehow everyone in the courtroom heard it. The room fell completely silent. No rustling papers, no whispered conversations, no movement. Just silence. I sat frozen in my chair. The judge stared at me as though he had just seen a ghost. My father looked irritated. Michael looked confused. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said carefully. "Would you please stand?" I slowly rose to my feet. Every eye in the room followed me. For a moment I wondered if I had somehow done something wrong. The judge continued studying me. Then he asked a question I never expected. "Were you serving near Kandahar 5 years ago?" My stomach tightened. "Yes, sir." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge nodded slowly. "And were you the Army captain who entered a burning operations building multiple times after an enemy attack?" The room became even quieter. I could actually hear the air conditioning system humming above us. I hesitated. Not because I was hiding anything. I simply hated talking about it. "Yes, sir." The judge closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked emotional. Very emotional. My father shifted uncomfortably. "What does this have to do with anything?" he asked. The judge ignored him. Instead, he continued looking at me. "Captain Rachel Morgan. I hadn't heard anyone call me that in months. Not since leaving active service." The title sounded strange inside a probate courtroom. The judge nodded to himself. Then he turned toward the spectators, toward the attorneys, toward everyone. "I cannot believe this." My father frowned. "Your Honor." The judge finally looked at him. What happened next changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "You really don't know who your daughter is, do you?" The question hit my father like a slap. His face reddened immediately. "What is that supposed to mean?" The judge leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. "I owe this woman more than I can ever repay." The room exploded into whispers. My father looked stunned. Michael looked even worse. I felt my heart begin to pound. Because suddenly I knew exactly what was happening. The letter, the young lieutenant, the father. Oh my God. The judge wasn't just someone who had heard about the rescue. He was the father. The realization hit me all at once. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me. The judge slowly stood. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. My son was serving in Afghanistan 5 years ago. His voice was steady, but emotion lingered beneath every word. He was trapped inside a building after an enemy attack. Several people in the courtroom leaned forward. The judge continued. "The military informed us there had been casualties." His eyes drifted toward the floor. I still remember receiving that phone call. For the first time, he sounded less like a judge and more like a father. A father remembering one of the worst days of his life. My wife and I spent hours believing our son might be dead. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We later learned he survived because a combat medic repeatedly entered a burning structure to rescue trapped soldiers. He looked at me. directly at me. That medic was Captain Rachel Morgan. A collective gasp swept across the room. I heard someone whisper, "Wow." Another person muttered, "No way." My father simply stared. The confident smile he'd worn all morning had vanished completely. The judge wasn't finished. Most people never hear about acts of courage like that. His gaze moved across the room. They happen every day among the men and women who serve this country. Then he looked back at my father. But occasionally one of those stories becomes very personal. His voice softened. My son came home because of her. Nobody spoke. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me. The attention made me uncomfortable. It always had. I wished I could disappear. But the judge continued. Captain Morgan suffered injuries during the rescue. I quietly shook my head. They weren't serious. He smiled sadly. That's exactly what my son said you would say. A few people laughed softly. The tension broke for a moment. Then the judge reached into his briefcase. He opened a worn leather folder. From inside, he removed a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. A copy of the letter. The one he had written years earlier. I keep this in my office. His voice grew quieter. I read it every Veterans Day. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected that. Not at all. The judge unfolded the paper. Then he read a few lines aloud. Not many. Just enough. Enough to understand. Enough to feel the weight behind the words. A father thanking the woman who saved his son. A family expressing gratitude that could never truly be repaid. When he finished, nobody spoke. Several people looked emotional. One elderly woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. Even one of the attorneys looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing you've misjudged someone. The judge folded the letter carefully. Then he turned toward my father again. What surprises me most, he said, is that this appears to be news to her family. My father swallowed. For the first time all day, he looked unsure of himself. Michael finally spoke. You never told us. I looked at him. You never asked. The words came out gently. Not angry. Not bitter. Simply true. Michael looked away. My mother lowered her head. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. I wasn't sure whether they came from pride or guilt. Perhaps both. The judge slowly returned to his seat. But before sitting down, he said something that nobody in that room would ever forget, including me. He looked directly at my father. His expression was calm, controlled. Yet there was steel beneath it, the kind of steel that comes from conviction. You may not know who your daughter is, Mr. Morgan. The room held its breath. But I do. Silence. Absolute silence. My father had spent decades building a reputation, building authority, building status. Yet in that moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because the judge humiliated him, because the truth had. For years, Dad had viewed me as the disappointing daughter. The daughter who abandoned the family business. The daughter who chose military service over his approval. The daughter who could never measure up to Michael. Now strangers in the courtroom were looking at me with more respect than my father had shown in 20 years. And for the first time, I think he realized it. The judge glanced back down at the estate documents. His expression changed. The emotional moment was over. Now he was a judge again. Professional. Methodical. Sharp. He picked up one of the files. Flipped through several pages. Then stopped. His eyes narrowed. The room grew quiet once more. A different kind of quiet. Not emotional. Concerned. The judge examined a document. Then another. Then another. Slowly he looked toward my father's attorney. Counselor. The attorney straightened. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the paperwork with one finger. His face had become unreadable. I have a question regarding these asset transfers. My father's expression changed instantly, and for the first time that day, I saw fear. Real fear. The fear appeared for only a second. Most people in the courtroom probably missed it. I didn't. When you've spent years in the military, you learn to notice tiny changes in people. A tightened jaw, a sudden shift in posture, a glance that lasts a fraction too long. Fear has a way of revealing itself, and my father was afraid. The judge held up a document. Counselor, can you explain this transfer? My father's attorney adjusted his glasses. Which transfer, Your Honor? The Riverside property. The attorney accepted the document. His confident expression faded almost immediately. I'll need a moment. The judge nodded. You have one. A strange tension settled over the room. The kind that appears when something unexpected enters the conversation. Something nobody planned for. My father sat perfectly still. Too still. Michael noticed it too. Dad? No response. Dad? My father finally looked at him. It's nothing. But it didn't sound like nothing. The judge continued reviewing paperwork. Several minutes passed. Then he located another document. His expression darkened further. Interesting. Nobody liked the sound of that word, especially lawyers. The attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, there may be a clerical explanation. Perhaps. The judge picked up another file. Then maybe you can explain this one as well. The attorney accepted it. Read it. Then frowned. I watched him carefully. Whatever he was seeing, he clearly hadn't expected it. That surprised me. Until that moment, I had assumed everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Apparently they didn't. The judge leaned back. Let's take a brief recess. His gavel struck. People immediately began whispering. Attorneys gathered around tables. Spectators discussed the military story they'd just heard. The atmosphere felt completely different now. The inheritance hearing had transformed into something else. Something bigger. I remained seated. I wasn't interested in gossip. I simply wanted answers. A few moments later, my mother approached. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Fragile. Rachel. I looked up. Hi, Mom. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I already knew what she meant. The rescue. She nodded. Why didn't you tell us? I offered a sad smile. When would I have told you? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew the answer. There hadn't been a moment. Not one. Over the years, our conversations had become polite exchanges about weather holidays and schedules. Nothing deeper. Nothing real. My mother sat beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something that hurt more than I expected. I should have asked. I nodded. Yeah. She looked down at her hands. I should have asked a lot of things. Across the room, Michael was arguing quietly with our father. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read body language. Michael looked frustrated. Dad looked defensive. That alone felt unusual. For most of my life, Michael had followed Dad's lead without question. Now something had changed. The recess ended 15 minutes later. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge immediately resumed reviewing documents. No small talk, no delay. Straight to business. Before proceeding, he said, I have concerns regarding several transactions connected to this estate. The room became silent again. The attorney rose. We are prepared to address any concerns, Your Honor. Good. The judge held up a folder. Because I have many. A few people exchanged nervous glances. The judge began listing dates, property transfers, investment reallocations, changes to ownership records. Most sounded incredibly boring. Until he reached one specific date. A date that made my mother's face go pale. The judge noticed. So you recognize that date? My mother hesitated. Yes. What is its significance? She looked toward my father. For a moment I thought she might remain silent, just as she had remained silent so many times before. Then something unexpected happened. She answered. That was the week my father was hospitalized. The room grew still. The judge nodded. Your father being Henry Lawson? Yes. My grandfather. The judge continued. Medical records indicate he was heavily medicated during that period. My father's attorney stood quickly. Objection. On what grounds? The attorney hesitated. The judge waited. No answer came. Finally, the judge continued. During that same period, multiple estate modifications were executed. The room seemed to shrink around us. I looked at my father. His face had become expressionless, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The judge wasn't accusing anyone yet. He was simply laying out facts, yet those facts sounded increasingly troubling. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge opened another folder. A thick one. He removed a handwritten document. What is that? Michael asked. Nobody answered. The judge examined the paper carefully. Then he spoke. This appears to be an earlier version of Mr. Lawson's estate plan. My heartbeat quickened. Earlier version? The attorney looked confused. I wasn't aware such a document existed. Apparently, neither were several other people. The judge began reading portions aloud. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to establish a shocking fact. My grandfather's original estate plan had divided assets equally between Michael and me. 50-50. Exactly equally. The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly now. Even the attorneys looked stunned. I sat frozen, unable to process what I had heard. Equal. Grandpa had intended equal. All these years, I had assumed he simply preferred Michael, just like Dad did. Apparently, I had been wrong. Very wrong. My throat tightened. I suddenly remembered countless conversations with Grandpa. The way he'd always treated me fairly. The way he'd never compared me to Michael. The way he'd always listened. Of course. Of course he hadn't cut me out. He never would've. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Across the room, Michael looked horrified. "Dad!" My father stared straight ahead. Not moving. Not speaking. Michael's voice shook. "Dad, what is this?" Still no answer. The judge folded the document, then looked directly at my father. "Mr. Morgan." "Nothing." "Mr. Morgan." Slowly, Dad raised his eyes. The judge's voice remained calm, but firm. "Can you explain why your father-in-law's original estate plan differs so dramatically from the final version?" Silence. A long silence. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, William Morgan appeared completely unprepared. The man always had answers, always had explanations, always controlled the room. Not today. The judge continued. Perhaps more importantly, he lifted another document. "Can you explain why several transfers appear to benefit only one beneficiary?" Michael looked stunned. "Beneficiary." The judge turned a page. "Your son." The color drained from Michael's face, because suddenly he realized something. This wasn't simply about me being excluded. This wasn't just favoritism. This was something far more serious. If these documents were accurate, my father hadn't merely hurt me. He may have manipulated an entire estate. An estate belonging to a dying man who trusted him. And for the first time, Michael looked at Dad not with admiration, but with doubt. The judge closed the folder. His expression was grave. "I'm ordering a full review of these records." The room exploded into murmurs. My father finally spoke. "That's ridiculous." The judge's gaze hardened. "No, Mr. Morgan." He paused. "What's ridiculous is that these questions were never asked sooner." And suddenly I understood something. The inheritance hearing wasn't ending. It was just beginning. For most of my life, my father had been the strongest man in every room. Not physically, not emotionally, but socially, financially, professionally. People listened when William Morgan spoke. Bankers respected him. Business owners sought his advice. Church leaders praised his generosity. Neighbors admired his success. My father had spent decades building a reputation. And now, for the first time, I was watching cracks form in that foundation. The court-ordered review moved quickly, faster than I expected. The judge postponed further estate proceedings pending investigation. Within weeks, accountants began examining records, property transactions, bank statements, estate documents, tax filings, everything. I returned to my normal life. At least I tried to. I was no longer on active duty, having recently transitioned into civilian healthcare work at a veterans medical center outside Columbus. My days were filled with patients, men and women who had served. Many carried visible wounds. Others carried invisible ones. Working with them helped keep me grounded. The courtroom drama felt distant, until the phone calls started. First came my mother, then my attorney, then Michael. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone suddenly wanted answers. For years, nobody had shown much interest in my life. Now, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, my attorney called. "Rachel, I thought you'd want an update." I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. "Good news or bad news?" A pause. "Depends on how you define good." That wasn't encouraging. What did they find? More than expected. I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Several transactions appeared questionable. Some occurred while my grandfather was heavily medicated. Others involved sudden ownership changes. A few signatures were being examined by forensic specialists. The words made my stomach turn. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. Deep down, I think I had known for years that something wasn't right. I simply never wanted to believe my father could go that far. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Profoundly sad. Because every new discovery damaged not only my father, it damaged the entire family. A week later, the local newspaper published an article. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief report about an ongoing probate dispute involving a prominent businessman. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts. Yet that was enough. In small communities, people noticed things. Within days, rumors spread. Questions followed. Business associates became cautious. Clients grew nervous. People started talking. For the first time in decades, my father was no longer controlling the narrative. The truth was beginning to speak for itself. Then Michael showed up at my house. Unannounced. I nearly didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted. Older. Defeated. Nothing like the confident older brother I remembered. When I opened the door, he stood there awkwardly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I usually paid bills and sorted mail. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Michael stared at his coffee for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. "Did you know what? That Grandpa wanted things divided equally." I shook my head. "No." His shoulders slumped. "I didn't either." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed bitterly. "I spent my entire life believing I earned everything." His words carried genuine pain. Not arrogance, pain. I thought Dad trusted me more. I looked at him carefully. The realization was hitting him hard. Because favoritism hurts everyone, including the favorite, especially the favorite. It creates impossible expectations, distorted relationships, false confidence. Michael was finally seeing that. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. "I know. I honestly thought Grandpa changed his mind." "I know." He looked at me. His eyes were red. "You hate me, don't you?" The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Years of resentment, years of unfair treatment, years of comparisons. Then I shook my head. "No." His expression softened slightly. "I probably would." I smiled sadly. "Maybe when I was younger." We sat in silence. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We weren't arguing. We weren't playing roles assigned by our father. We were simply two people trying to understand what had happened to our family. Before leaving, Michael stopped at the door. "Rachel." "Yeah, I'm sorry." The words were simple, but sincere, and somehow that mattered. A lot. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice sounded fragile. "Would you come by?" I almost said no. Almost. Instead, I drove to the house where I grew up. The same house. The same front porch. The same maple tree in the yard. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow smaller. My mother greeted me at the door. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had changed. She looked exhausted, emotionally exhausted. We sat in the living room, the room where decades of family history had unfolded. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, silences, all of it. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands. Then she finally said what she'd been carrying for years. I knew some things weren't right. I remained silent. I didn't know everything. Her voice cracked. But I knew enough. The words hurt. Not because they shocked me. Because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. "You could have said something." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I know." "You could have defended me." "I know." "You could have stopped some of it." She lowered her head. "I know." The room fell silent. For years I had imagined this conversation. Imagined yelling. Imagined anger. Imagined confrontation. Instead, all I felt was sadness. My mother wasn't evil. She wasn't cruel. She was weak. And weakness has consequences, sometimes devastating ones. Before I left, she hugged me. For a long time. Longer than she ever had when I was young. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say. Weeks turned into months. The investigation continued. Evidence accumulated. Questions multiplied. Meanwhile, my father seemed to withdraw from the world. Friends stopped calling as often. Business lunches disappeared. Community invitations slowed. People who once praised him now avoided uncomfortable conversations. Success attracts company. Scandal creates distance. One evening I drove past his office building. The parking lot was nearly empty. The lights were off. For some reason, that image stayed with me. Not because I enjoyed it. Because I didn't. The man who had spent decades chasing status was discovering how fragile status really is. Money can disappear. Reputation can collapse. Power can fade. What remains is character. And character is much harder to build. A few days later, I received another call from my attorney. The review is almost complete. I stared out my apartment window. And a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Rachel, I think your father is about to lose far more than this case." After the call ended, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking, not about inheritance, not about money, not about revenge. I thought about family, about choices, about consequences. And somewhere across town, for perhaps the first time in his life, William Morgan was sitting alone with his own. 3 weeks after my attorney told me the investigation was nearly complete, I received a phone call I never expected. It was my father. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. William Morgan. I couldn't remember the last time he'd called me first. Usually communication happened through my mother. Or not at all. The phone rang 4 times before I answered. Hello? Silence. Then his voice, older than I remembered. Tired. Rachel. I waited. I'd like to see you. No apology. No explanation. Just those words. I leaned back in my chair. Why? Another pause. Because there are things I should have said a long time ago. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 20 years that statement felt absurd. There were thousands of things he should have said. Thousands. Instead, he had chosen silence. Criticism. Distance. I looked out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. I don't know if that's a good idea. I understand. His voice sounded defeated. Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. Something about that unsettled me. My father had never sounded defeated before, not once. Finally, he spoke again. Please. One word. Quiet. Almost fragile. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to protect myself from whatever came next. But another part of me was tired. Tired of carrying old wounds. Tired of unanswered questions. Tired of wondering why. There's a veterans memorial park near downtown. I knew the place. A peaceful park overlooking the river. Several monuments. Rows of engraved names. A place people visited to remember. To reflect. To grieve. Tomorrow morning. Okay, and that was it. The call ended. I barely slept that night, not because I feared him, because I feared disappointment. Again. The next morning was cool and overcast. The kind of Ohio morning that feels older than the calendar says. I arrived early. Old habits from military life. My father was already there, sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. For a moment I simply watched him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, spiritually. Like life had finally become heavier than he could carry. When I approached, he stood, awkwardly, almost nervously. I couldn't remember ever seeing him nervous. Thanks for coming. I nodded. Neither of us sat immediately. The silence stretched between us. 20 years of silence. Finally, I sat on the bench. He sat beside me, several feet away, like strangers. Maybe that's what we were. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled nearby trees. A flag moved gently above the memorial. Eventually, my father broke the silence. I saw the investigation report. I waited. They found enough. His voice sounded hollow. The findings had been devastating. Several estate modifications had been ruled improper. Multiple transfers had been reversed. The final legal consequences were still being resolved. But the truth was no longer in doubt. I know. He stared at the memorial wall. I deserve most of what's happened. The admission surprised me. My father had spent his entire life avoiding responsibility, yet here he was, accepting it, at least partially. Still, I wasn't ready to make things easy. Most of it, he nodded slowly. Fair question. For several seconds, he gathered his thoughts. Then he surprised me again. I wasn't angry because you joined the army. I blinked. Of all the things I expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. What? I know that's what you believed. It is what you said. I know. His eyes remained fixed on the memorial.
But it wasn't the truth.
I folded my arms. Then what was? The answer took a long time to come. When it finally did, it arrived in a voice I'd never heard before. A wounded voice. My brother. I frowned. My Uncle Daniel had died long before I was born. The family rarely spoke about him. Almost never. He enlisted when he was 19. My father swallowed. He was killed overseas. The wind seemed to stop. For a moment, the world felt very quiet. I know. No. He shook his head. You know the facts. His eyes grew distant. I remember the funeral. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. I remember my mother crying every night. He stared toward the river. I remember my father never being the same again. I listened, not interrupting. For the first time in my life, my father was letting me see something beneath the armor. Something real. When you told me you'd enlisted, his voice cracked. All I could think about was Daniel. I sat perfectly still. Years of memories suddenly looked different. The arguments, the anger, the criticism, the constant disapproval. I thought I'd lose you too. The words hit me harder than I expected. My father rubbed his face. For a moment, he looked like an exhausted old man. Not the powerful businessman everyone knew. Just an old man carrying decades of grief. I was terrified. He laughed bitterly. And instead of admitting that, he shook his head. I punished you for it. The truth settled heavily between us. Not an excuse. An explanation. Those are very different things. I understood that. He understood it too. I should have been proud of you. His voice trembled. Instead, every promotion made me angry. I stared at him, not because I doubted him, because I believed him. Every word. I kept waiting for you to quit. He laughed softly. You never did. No. A faint smile appeared. No. For the first time that morning, we shared something close to humor. Then his smile vanished. His eyes filled with tears, real tears. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. Not when his parents died. Not when businesses struggled. Not ever. Now tears rolled down his face, and he didn't even try to hide them. I failed you. The words came out broken, raw, honest. I failed you as a father. I felt my own eyes sting. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. Nothing was fixed. Years of damage don't disappear in one conversation. But honesty matters. Truth matters. And this was the first completely honest conversation we'd ever had. He looked at me. I am so sorry, Rachel. Not for the estate. Not for the investigation. Not for getting caught. For me. For us. For everything. The difference mattered. A lot. The wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere nearby a church bell rang. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Just heavy. Human. My father wiped his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked toward the memorial wall. Rows of names. Rows of stories. Rows of people who had sacrificed. Life teaches difficult lessons. Sometimes far too late. Maybe this was one of them. Finally, I looked back at him. The man who had hurt me. The man who had failed me. The man who was still my father. And for the first time in 20 years, I honestly considered forgiving him. A month after my conversation with my father at the Veterans Memorial Park, the estate case finally came to an end. By then, most of the legal questions had been answered. The investigation had confirmed what the judge had suspected. Several changes to my grandfather's estate had been made improperly. Assets that should never have been redirected were restored. The final ruling wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No shocking television-style courtroom scene. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were documents, hearings, corrections, and eventually resolution. My grandfather's wishes were honored.